In 1997, Florida did something that sounds like a mistake. State scientists walked into a wetland, opened their containers, and let go of thousands of Australian weevils onto a tree they had been fighting for decades and losing to. The tree behind all of it was Melaleuca. By the early 1990s, it had swallowed close to 500,000 acres of South Florida, turning open sawgrass marsh into shoulder-to-shoulder forest so dense a person could not walk through it. Bulldozers had barely dented it, herbicide slowed it down, and then it grew right back. So the people trying to save the Everglades did something that sounds even stranger than the problem. They imported the one thing that had ever held this tree in check back in Australia. They imported its enemies. What almost nobody remembers is how the tree got to Florida in the first place. It did not blow in on a storm. It did not hitch a ride in someone's luggage. A Florida forester carried it across an ocean on purpose, planted it with his own hands, and then spent years convincing the state to spread it as far and as fast as possible. He had exactly one job in mind for it: drain the swamp. His name was John Gifford, and in 1906 he was the first American ever to hold a doctorate in forestry. Gifford had trained at Cornell, then moved down to Coconut Grove and thrown himself into the biggest engineering dream in Florida at the time. The dream was to empty the Everglades. To a lot of ambitious men in that era, the largest wetland in North America looked like wasted real estate. A useless swamp sitting on top of land that could be farmed and sold if someone could just get the water off it. Gifford dedicated one of his books to Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, the governor remembered as the father of the Everglades Drainage Project. That tells you how respectable the idea was. Draining the Everglades carried the full backing of the state's own leadership. Gifford thought he had the perfect tool for the job. He wanted a tree that drank hard and grew fast, one that could pull water out of the ground and breathe it into the air faster than the marsh could refill. In November of 1906, he got what he was looking for. A shipment of seeds arrived from John Maiden, the director of the Royal Botanic Garden in Sydney, carrying the seed of an Australian paperbark tree that seemed built for exactly this kind of work. Gifford planted the first seeds at a government plant station in Miami, then at his own home on Biscayne Bay, and got more shipments from Maiden over the next several years. And here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The tree did everything he promised. It grew 3 to 6 feet a year. It shrugged off flooding, drought, fire, and poor soil. It thrived in the exact wet ground where almost nothing else Gifford tried would take. On paper, he had found the perfect machine. There is a bitter irony buried in this part of the story. The same man who introduced this tree to help drown the Everglades later became one of its loudest defenders. He helped push for the creation of Everglades National Park. So the man remembered today as a founding friend of the Everglades is the same man who handed it the single worst plant threat it would ever face. And he was not even the only one bringing it in. Records later showed that Melaleuca had come into Florida through more than a dozen separate introductions, scattered between the 1880s and the 1950s, the earliest all the way back in 1886 near Sarasota. Different nurseries, different collectors, different corners of Florida, all importing the same tough Australian tree for the same reason. By the time anyone worried about it, its genetics were already a broad, healthy mix from multiple sources, which is exactly what you do not want in a species you are about to try to eradicate. Because a tree that grows anywhere, in any conditions, with no natural enemies, does not stay in the yard where you plant it. For a couple of decades, the paperbark spread slowly, mostly where people put it. Then the effort got aggressive. In the 1930s, seed was loaded into airplanes and scattered from the sky over the eastern Everglades, a deliberate attempt to seed the whole basin and convert it into forest. Around the same time, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers planted the tree along levees near Lake Okeechobee to hold the soil in place. And nurserymen, who had figured out this was one of the cheapest trees in the world to propagate, quietly scattered its seed into wild areas so they would have free stock to dig up and sell later. Nobody was coordinating any of this. Everybody was feeding the same fire. By the time Florida understood what it had done, the paperbark had stopped being a tool and turned into an occupation, and what made it nearly unstoppable came down to arithmetic. Consider what a single mature Melaleuca is carrying. Its branches hold clusters of small woody capsules, and each of those capsules holds a few hundred seeds, so a full-grown tree can store somewhere between 2 and 20 million seeds at once. Those seeds can sit sealed inside the capsules, viable and dormant, for up to 10 years just waiting. And the tree can flower up to 5 times a year, which means it is almost always making more. Then there is how it lets go of them. The tree holds all of that seed in reserve until something goes wrong. Any serious stress, a fire, a freeze, a cut from a chainsaw, breaks the flow of water to those capsules and triggers them to crack open at once, dumping their seed onto the ground in a single massive release. This is a survival strategy. The tree is built to answer a disaster by flooding the ground with the next generation. Now put that next to fire. South Florida burns. Lightning sets the marsh alight almost every year, and the native sawgrass evolved to live with it. But Melaleuca did something clever with fire. Its bark and its leaves are loaded with volatile oil, so a Melaleuca stand actively feeds a fire, pushing the flames far hotter and higher than a grass fire ever goes. Those hot fires kill the competition and clear the ground. And then, cued by the exact heat that just leveled everything else, the surviving trees release their millions of seeds onto fresh open soil with no rivals left standing. It is a loop that pays the tree every single time it runs. Fire clears the field, the tree reseeds the field, the new trees grow up carrying even more oil, and the next fire burns hotter still. Every disaster in the Everglades quietly became a Melaleuca recruitment drive. Left alone, a single stand could go from a few scattered trees to a closed Melaleuca forest within a couple of decades. That is a takeover fast enough to watch happen inside a single human lifetime. So how bad did it get? By 1993, surveys estimated Melaleuca was infesting roughly 500,000 acres of South Florida, and the tree had already been added to the federal noxious weed list in 1992. Where it formed those dense stands, native plant diversity in the invaded wet prairies collapsed by somewhere between 60 and 80%. The sawgrass, the open sloughs, the wet prairie that fed the wading birds and the alligators, all of it got replaced by a dark, closed canopy that a heron cannot hunt in and a deer cannot walk through. Here is where the popular version of this story needs a correction. Everyone repeats that Melaleuca was draining the Everglades by drinking it dry, one thirsty tree at a time. But when researchers actually strapped water sensors onto these trees and measured, they found that an individual paperbark does not necessarily outdrink a native bald cypress or a slash pine growing right next to it. The real damage came down to two things the popular story leaves out: density and structure. The Everglades is not a lake. It is a sheet of water only a few inches deep, moving very slowly across a nearly flat shelf of limestone all the way from Lake Okeechobee down to the sea. That thin, slow, wide flow is the entire physical engine of the ecosystem. When you replace open marsh with a wall-to-wall forest, you intercept the rain before it lands. You jack up how much water the canopy breathes back into the sky, and you break the shallow sheet flow that everything downstream depends on. At one study site, the Melaleuca stand accounted for around 21% of the water leaving that ground, purely because so many trees were crammed into it. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of acres, and you are effectively re-plumbing the Everglades one stand at a time. One economic assessment projected that if the invasion were left completely unchecked, Melaleuca could cost South Florida close to $2 billion by 2010 once you added up the lost tourism, the lost recreation, the fire damage, and the hit to endangered species. This had stopped being a gardening problem. It was now a direct threat to the water supply and the economy of millions of people. And the first serious attempts to fight back made it worse. Managers did the obvious thing. They cut the trees down and they burned the stands, trying to clear them out fast. Now remember what stress does to this tree. Cutting a Melaleuca down set off the exact response it had evolved for. Every capsule on that tree cracked open and rained seed down onto the freshly cleared sunlit ground, which happens to be the precise nursery a Melaleuca seedling wants most. Crews would clear a stand and come back to find 1,000 seedlings standing where one tree used to be. Herbicide worked better, and to this day it is the backbone of Melaleuca control, but it kept running into a wall no chemical could climb. You could kill every standing tree in a stand, and the soil underneath would still be loaded with years of dropped seed, viable and patient and completely out of reach. Clear an area, walk away for a season, and the paperbark came right back from the ground up. That was the trap Florida was stuck in by the 1990s. Every method that removed the adult trees also handed the next generation a clean, open, competition-free bed to grow in. The state was spending a fortune to garden its own worst weed. If you are finding this story worth your time, take a second to subscribe. This channel goes deep on the strange, forgotten ways America broke and then repaired its own wild places, and there is a lot more where this came from. By the mid-1990s, the search for a real answer had moved into a laboratory in Fort Lauderdale, where a team of federal scientists with the U.S. Department of Agriculture was chasing a completely different idea. If the paperbark had exploded across Florida mainly because it had left all of its natural enemies behind in Australia, then maybe the fix was to go to Australia, find those enemies, and carefully bring some of them across. This is called classical biological control, and it is one of the highest high-wire acts in the entire field of conservation. The history of invasive species is full of well-meaning people who released one creature to control another and ended up with two disasters instead of one. So the standard now is deliberately brutal. Before a single insect is ever released, it spends years locked in quarantine, offered dozens of native plants and crops one after another to see whether it will feed on anything except the exact target. If there is any real chance it turns on a native species, it never leaves the lab. The USDA team, led by entomologist Ted Center, put every candidate through exactly that gauntlet. And it was slow, and plenty of candidates washed out. One promising leaf-eating sawfly cleared its host testing, and then its release was suspended anyway because researchers decided they needed even more study before they would trust it in the wild. That is the level of caution we are talking about. The first insect to make it all the way through was a small, dull, brown Australian weevil called Oxyops vitiosa, better known as the Melaleuca weevil. Its method is simple and specific. The adult weevil and its larvae feed on Melaleuca's young leaves, the fresh new growth, scraping the tissue right down to the waxy skin and leaving little windows behind. That does two things at once. It starves the tree of the new foliage it needs to grow, and it cripples the tree's ability to make seed. In 1997, after all the testing was finally finished, the weevil was released into South Florida. It took hold fast. By the end of 2002, the weevil had established itself across 12 South Florida counties, and on the trees it was attacking, it was cutting seed production by around 80%. For the first time in nearly a century, the tree's arithmetic was working against it instead of for it. To speed things along, agencies ran a redistribution campaign, moving the weevil out to new ground in batches of 5,000 insects at a time to reach stands it had not found on its own. But the weevil had one weakness, and in a place like the Everglades, it was a serious one. When the weevil finishes its larval stage, it drops to the ground and pupates in dry soil, in a wetland that stays flooded for months on end. That pupa simply drowns. So the weevil thrived along the drier edges and on the raised tree islands, but out across the vast flooded interior, the actual heart of the Everglades, it could barely get a foothold, which is why the second insect mattered so much. In February of 2002, the same USDA program released a second Australian native, a tiny sap-sucking psyllid called Boreoglycaspis melaleucae, the Melaleuca psyllid. It is about the size of a gnat, and it attacks the tree from a completely different direction. It drains the sap straight out of the leaves and stems, and it is especially lethal to seedlings, the young plants the weevil could never reach. Crews seeded each site with 7,000 to 10,000 of them at a time and let them spread. The psyllid solved the weevil's problem almost exactly. It spends its whole life cycle up in the tree, never touching the ground, so standing water means nothing to it. It could go where the weevil could not go, and its effect on the youngest, most vulnerable plants was dramatic. In one field study, only 40% of Melaleuca seedlings survived when the psyllid was feeding on them, compared to 95% survival on the seedlings it was kept away from. In some spots, the psyllid populations climbed so high, they were killing small saplings outright. The insect was wiping out the next generation before it could ever grow up. The program did not stop at 2 agents either. In 2008, researchers added a third, a midge called Lophodiplosis trifida that twists the tree's growing tips into deformed galls. An earlier candidate, a bud gall fly released in 2005, was tried and simply failed to establish, and that is worth saying out loud, because in this field, plenty of releases just quietly do not work. The honest programs report the failures right alongside the wins. So what did all of this actually add up to in the swamp? On its own, no single bug was ever going to clear that much forest, and nobody expected it to. The insects were the missing half of a combination. Herbicide and heavy machinery took out the big standing trees. Then the weevil and the psyllid moved into the cleared ground and did the one thing that chemicals and chainsaws never could. They attacked the comeback. They ate the seedlings and starved the survivors so that when a stand got cleared, it actually stayed cleared instead of erupting into 1,000 new trees the next season. That combination finally broke the trap. With the insects holding down the regeneration, the numbers finally started moving the right way. Melaleuca has now been pushed off most of the public land in South Florida, and where it tries to creep back in from untended private property, the weevils and the psyllids are already living in the trees, waiting to knock it down again. The tree is not gone. But after 100 years, it is finally being held in place by something that never clocks out, which brings us all the way back to a shipment of seeds from Sydney and a forester who was sure he had found the perfect machine. Everything Gifford wanted from this tree, it delivered. The fast growth, the iron toughness, the appetite for the wettest and most stubborn ground in Florida. He just had it pointed the wrong way. Every single trait that made this tree a perfect tool for draining a swamp turned out to be the trait that made it a perfect weapon for destroying one the moment there was nobody left to tell it where to stop. The tree is still out there, and in some form it always will be. Keeping it in check now means keeping those insect populations alive across the entire system. A job with no end date, running quietly in the background of one of the most expensive restoration efforts ever attempted. As of today, the largest wetland restoration project in the world is being held together, in part, by 2 Australian insects most people will never even see, patiently eating away at a mistake that took an airplane and 100 years to make. And that fight against the paperbark points straight at a much stranger question that scientists are now asking about a completely different tree. What do you do when the species you want to save is already gone, wiped off the map so completely that the only way to bring it back is to rebuild its genes from scratch? That is the story of the American chestnut, and it is even harder to believe than this one.